Welcome back to the deep dive. We got a really interesting suggestion from you, an article by Jaime Hoerricks called Screams and Softness, Why Andrea Dworkin Must Be Read Now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece. We've spent some time with it, really pulling out the key insights.
Our goal here, as always, is to give you a solid handle on this, why Dworkin's ideas are still sparking conversation, especially around things like patriarchy, femmeness, and resistance today.
And Hoerricks, who holds a PhD, sets it up really well. They're not saying you have to agree with Dworkin on everything.
Right.
It's more about using her work to understand, well, the violence we still see, where it comes from. And that title, Screams and Softness. It grabs you, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Hoerricks starts with this concept they call softness. They describe it as a neuroqueer stance rooted in movement, in yielding without collapse.
So it's a kind of strength, but not rigidity, a different way of being in the world.
Exactly. And exploring that idea of softness actually leads them to revisit Andrea Dworkin's voice, which is, well, very different, much louder.
Much louder, yeah. And there's this one specific Dworkin quote that really hit home for Hoerricks. Why are you so slow?
And they clarify it's not about being slow intellectually.
No, it's about the frustration, the agonizingly slow pace at which society seems to recognize women as fully human, as equals.
Yeah.
That question, it still feels incredibly relevant, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And what Hoerricks does so effectively is put that softness in dialogue with Dworkin's scream.
Yeah, not as opposites fighting each other.
No, more like complementary responses, different ways to resist a world that, seems to demand you either harden until you shatter or just let yourself be broken.
Okay, so let's dig into that. How does softness and the scream actually work together in Hoerricks' view?
Well, their idea of softness isn't about giving up, it's active resistance.
Right, just different from Dworkin's very direct confrontational style. It's not surrender, but it's maybe quieter.
Exactly. It operates differently. Hoerricks uses this analogy of a duet. Dworkin's words are the explosive force, the yang, they call it. Sharp, cutting through the noise.
Creating space, maybe.
Yes. And then Hoerricks' softness is the counterbalance, the yin. It absorbs, it flows, it endures. Different expressions reacting to the same thing.
So resistance isn't just one thing. It can look and feel very different.
Precisely. Dworkin was incredibly powerful at naming the system itself. Male power is domination, male entitlement being the bedrock for laws, customs.
And the idea that women could be seen as disposable within that, she was blunt about it.
Very blunt. And Hoerricks kind of shifts the lens slightly, focusing on what it feels like to live inside that system.
Internal experience.
Yeah, the shutdown, the sensory flood, the unspeakable grief of being made illegible. It's the personal cost, the often hidden toll.
It's like Dworkin points out the wound, and Hoerricks describes the feeling of living with it day to day.
And Hoerricks makes this really interesting point that Dworkin's public rage, her scream, actually helps validate those internal feelings.
Even if Hoerricks doesn't resist in the same way, Dworkin's voice confirms that what they're feeling is real. It's a response to something real.
Exactly. Dworkin refused to be silent. Right. To let things go unchallenged. Hoerricks looks at silence differently, not as absence, but maybe as presence, listening.
And movement. They connect it to Tai Chi.
Yes, that analogy. In Tai Chi, yielding isn't weakness.
No, it's an active response. You move with the force to keep your balance, your ground. You don't just stand there and take the hit, but you don't necessarily meet force with force either.
And that's how Hoerricks understands their softness. It's a specific way of resisting, born from knowing how to hold your ground differently.
Okay, so Dworkin was writing about this raw power dynamic, primarily in the 80s. Hoerricks argues this isn't history.
Not at all. They say it's not a metaphor, it's the scaffolding of now, still the basic structure.
And they give contemporary examples, which really drives it home, like the Savvy Act, the potential impact on defining womanhood, potentially erasing trans women legally.
Or things like the mom medal, or baby bonuses. Incentives that kind of nudge women back towards primarily reproductive roles defined by the state.
And then there's the trad wife movement. It looks like nostalgia, maybe, but Hoerricks frames it as potentially a weaponized campaign pushing submission.
Yeah, repackaging old ideas.
And the point is, these things look different on the surface: legislation, money, social trends.
But they all kind of point towards the same goal: reasserting control over women's bodies, women's lives, which is exactly what Dworkin was talking about.
Her core insight was that sense of male entitlement to control, and it's systemic.
Right. Baked into laws, religion, schools, police, culture. The whole system often protects it.
And Hoerricks connects this directly to things happening right now, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, all the anti-trans and anti-abortion laws.
Even things like RFK Jr.'s proposal for an autism registry, raising flags about state tracking of those deemed outside the norm.
It suggests, a broader project, maybe not explicitly coordinated everywhere, but pushing people back into specific service roles, reproductive, emotional, looking a certain way.
And if you don't comply, if you don't fit,
Then you risk being seen as a threat or just expendable, ignorable.
which really underlines why Hoerricks is saying, read Dworkin now.
Yes, not just for the critique of, say, individual acts of violence, but for understanding the systems that allow it, that even encourage it.
Because patriarchy, as Dworkin saw it, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it uses policies, incentives, seemingly neutral things.
But the intent, the underlying push for control, is still harmful.
Okay, but reading Dworkin, it's not always a comfortable experience, is it?
No, definitely not. Her style is intense, confrontational, unapologetic. She wasn't trying to make friends or soothe anyone.
And Hoerricks acknowledges the criticisms, the really important ones, about how Dworkin's work sometimes excluded or misrepresented trans lives.
Absolutely. Those critiques are vital and need to be carried alongside her work. You can't ignore them.
But Hoerricks argues against just throwing Dworkin out entirely because of those flaws.
Right. They see her work as this incredibly sharp tool, like a surgical scalpel, for cutting through the polite facade of patriarchy.
It reveals the power dynamics, how they operate through bodies, laws, cultural norms, things we might otherwise overlook.
She named male supremacy not just as a bad attitude, but as a system, enforced by violence, legitimized by institutions.
And that rage people find off-putting. Hoerricks suggests maybe it's just a logical response, a vocalization of the system's own brutal logic.
Yeah, like if you truly see the system for what it is, maybe rage isn't irrational at all. It's the scream that names the injustice plainly.
There's this temptation, Hoerricks notes, to dismiss her because of her limitations, because she didn't get everything right or include everyone.
But they raise a challenging point. Maybe dismissing her is a kind of luxury.
A luxury for those less directly targeted by the very systems she was dissecting.
Potentially. Because for many marginalized people, trans folks, neurodivergent people, anyone whose feminist doesn't conform to those structures Dworkin wrote about, they're still very real forces in their lives.
So the message is, read her critically, know the limitations, understand the context.
But don't ignore the insights into power just because they're uncomfortable or imperfect.
Which brings us back to Hoerricks' softness. How does that fit in as a response?
They frame it not as rejecting Dworkin's rage, but as a form of survival. A way to resist when screaming isn't safe or possible or even the right strategy for you.
It comes from living on the receiving end of the system's quieter attacks.
Exactly. From the far edge of Dworkin's analysis, they say. Dealing with erasure, the pressure to conform, feeling like you might just disappear if you don't fit the mold.
And they define their feminist very specifically. Neuroqueer, autistic, relational, shaped by martial arts.
And crucially, it's not the softness of submission. It's a softness of stance, of refusal. Finding resilience through flow, like in Tai Chi.
So their movement practice isn't just a hobby, it's an embodied response to the system Dworkin described.
Yes. Felt physically. The pressures, the misgendering, the invalidation it lands in the body, in the nervous system.
So where Dworkin often focused on more visible violence.
Hoerricks highlights the invisible kind's administrative erasure, language that denies your existence, the things that wear you down differently.
Leading to different modes of resistance, Dworkin's blunt force.
Versus Hoerricks' redirection, grounding, that intentional yielding movement from Tai Chi. Resistance through presence, stillness, not necessarily spectacle.
Okay.
And Hoerricks concludes this thought by saying, look, Dworkin maybe didn't have the language for this specific kind of resistance.
But her work, her scream, by naming the conditions so forcefully.
It actually created the space for this other kind of resistance, this softness, to emerge and be seen as its own form of strength.
So wrapping this up, the main takeaway from Hoerricks isn't become a Dworkin disciple.
No, not at all. It's more like engage with her work because it gives us clarity on the structures of patriarchy that are still shaping our world.
These issues haven't gone away. They've just evolved, changed shape.
Exactly. They show up now in legislation, in social campaigns, things like the S2V Act, forced birth policies, the erasure of trans people, the trad wife thing.
These aren't just random events. Hoerricks argues, following Dworkin, that this is infrastructure. It's part of a system.
And understanding that system, even when it makes us uncomfortable, is crucial right now.
Especially when basic rights are being challenged so directly. Hoerricks says comfort isn't the priority here.
No, not when people's autonomy and equality are on the line, particularly for neurodivergent people, trans people, femme people who don't fit the boxes.
The article ends with a really powerful echo of Dworkin herself.
Yeah, that final call. Dworkin didn't scream just to be heard and then ignored.
She screamed, as Hoerricks puts it, so we would wake the fuck up and move. That's the key. Awareness isn't passive. It demands action.
Whatever that action looks like for each person, that feels like the essential message to take away.